Alright, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Nafta, your chairperson for today. Now I would like to introduce our presenter for this session, Mr. David Thakwal, that will be presenting on his paper on effects of shared reading of attitude, engagement, and English language proficiency of young Thai learners with low English proficiency. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's do it. Yeah, please welcome, sir.
Okay, I'm a member of the Faculty of Education. I teach in the graduate school in the Masters in TEFL program at Chile University. My co-author in this paper, Dr. Sumali Chinakul, couldn't be here today. She worked with me on the project. Some of my other research has included PEN program, explorations into early childhood literacy, four-skill language development, comparing the efficacy of teaching methods, and international standards price, a model for bilingual education in Thailand. Okay, you can get a hold of me if you've got additional questions or there's something else that's not related to this specifically. You can get me Dave at Teachers Guide Education. You can also have a peek at my YouTube channel where I put up a lot of resources for EFL teachers working in the Southeast Asia region. So feel free to have a wander through. Okay, a quick little bit of background about this project. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. It's an old English proverb that dates back to about 1175. And to put that in context of what we're doing, we can teach students, but we can't make them learn. If they don't want to learn, there is nothing you can do to make them learn. We can encourage them to learn. We can do other things to try and motivate them. But you cannot make them learn by themselves. And a lot of times I'll see articles in newspapers in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, asking, or students will be asking, why do we need to speak English? Or, I can't speak English and I don't want to. Why should I learn? It makes no sense to me, right? So it's those issues, those poor attitudes, I don't want to, who are learning English. The lack of participation in class because of it, and the resulting low language proficiency that this mixed method research study explored. Now, and I'll put the slides up on the internet so you can download them as soon as I get an internet connection at the hotel. The word's good enough to upload them. So there were three questions in the research project. To what extent does shared reading affect the change in attitudes? To what extent does shared reading affect the change in engagement in learning? And what effect does it have on English language proficiency? Now, it was a complex study, and in 25 minutes I won't have enough time to go through the whole thing. So I'll only look at the second question in this particular session. If you have questions about the other two or you want to discuss it at length, catch me at lunch, catch me at tea break in the morning, catch me wandering around here, and feel free to ask me questions. I like to talk. Okay? So, to what extent does shared reading affect the change in the engagement in learning? And the objective was to determine through observations what the extent of that effect was. So the population of this is part of a 15-year R&D project, looking at a made in Thailand model for affordable, high-quality, mainstream bilingual education. A lot of this is also equally valid in Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and other countries within the region, the exception probably being Singapore. because they're already above this level in most cases. This particular study looked at shared reading, and the population was 200 students in grade 2 at Saba School. The particular sample for this study was, we chose the lowest 15 students in the grade level. And they were chosen specifically because they have an attitude of, I don't want to, and you can't make me. Okay? There is nothing you can make me do to learn English. Full stop, thank you very much, I'm not going to learn. That's why they were chosen. And they were low academically as well as English proficiency. So it wasn't just English proficiency, they had a lot of other issues that we didn't go into specifically for this paper, but were looked at in the broader context. Okay, we looked at attitude changes, engagement, and changes in 4-skill language proficiency, and it was a 10-week, 20-session early intervention program. Okay, so it was a really short time frame, 10 weeks, 20 sessions, 30 minutes per session. And it must be noted that these children have been learning English for 2 years prior to this. So it wasn't starting with an empty cup. They had some background knowledge, but we had been unable to test it and validate the level of that language that they had. Okay, when they did test, they scored 0, typically, or very close to 0. So they were below a measurable level of language proficiency, but that doesn't mean there was nothing there. They had some background knowledge, but we couldn't measure it. Okay, we used a number of research instruments. We used a survey of attitudes pre and post for this session. And these were done, originally written in English, they were translated to Thai, back translated to English to confirm that we had semantic content. We also did cultural analysis to make sure that what the translated meaning meant the same thing as the English meaning in the original survey, so that we weren't asking them, do you like apples, and showing an orange. Okay, so we did semantic content, we did cultural analysis to make sure that the survey was also valid within the language changeover. We used standardized proficiency tests pre and post to look at changes in language proficiency. And engagement, and this is the one I'm going to look at today, measured by means of scoring rubric and a record sheet of student participation. And we looked at the language output quality. Okay, was it nonverbal communication? Were they using single word answers, yes, no? Were they using something more complex, blue sky? Okay, so what was the type of language output? And participation. How many interactions per student per session? Okay, engagement measured by the scoring rubric, language output quality, quantity, participation. Oops, sorry. Each reading session was video recorded with multiple cameras for after-the-fact detailed analysis of student participation and language output. Okay, so we had several cameras mounted around the room so we could catch all of the audio, all of the video, all of the action, and all of the interaction, and they didn't know they were being taped. Okay, so little tiny sport cameras, like the one that's sitting on the chair up front here, were stuck in the corners or glued up on the walls, and they didn't realize that everything was being taped. So we could go back after the fact and look at all the data, because as a single researcher in a classroom trying to do shared reading with a class and record data is really difficult. So to make sure we caught everything, we had it recorded. It took about 150 hours per 10-hour grouping to go back and reanalyze all the data. Okay, the record sheet of student participation. So we looked at the language quality, outputs on a score from 0 to 3, quantity output, participation, added up their scores, and left room for additional fonts that we could record as the researcher, or observations or comments that we thought were appropriate based on the videos that we were watching. Okay, the criteria for scoring. No attempt at utterances. Utterances are incomprehensible or just gibberish. They use single words or short phrases. Utterances might have been out of context or still inappropriate. They tried to use phrases or short sentences that were in context or were appropriate, right? And so we looked at the quality, we looked at the quantity, and we looked at the participation on a score from 0 to 3. And this gave us our scoring for the students so that we could look at it. This is the interesting part, the results. Okay, at the beginning of session 1, as I said, they were basically unmeasurable. Most of them were close to 0. That doesn't mean they didn't know anything. It meant that we couldn't measure what they knew by using any standardized form of testing. Okay, but by the end of week 4, we start to see improvements in their scores. And by the end of week 10, we see in some cases dramatic improvements in the score. Now those are the cumulative score based on that rubric. Okay, so we used the rubric, we came up with the cumulative score. So to go from 0 to 6 or 0 to 7 or 8 is a substantial improvement and increase in participation by the students, in engagement and interaction from the students, and their attempts at language output. No longer was it a case of I can't and you can't make me. Now it's a case of I want to talk. And English is the only tool I have. I will try to use it. I'm using it because I want to communicate. I'm the student, I want to communicate. Okay, so within any particular field, it was low, we went up the majority of scores at the beginning. Other observations we took a look at in the score sheet by week 4. The signs and the changes, and although they're still low, the mean of the scores was up 3.45, up from less than 1. That's not bad when you consider a maximum score of 9. That's a 30% increase in output. Quantifiable, measurable. Okay, negative behaviors. This is a big one, right? And as teachers with a bunch of kids in class that don't like to work, negative behaviors became far less common or did not occur. And that's a big one as teachers. Those negative disruptive behaviors started to disappear because the students were engaged in class. And we began to see signs of positive behaviors in the form of being more settled, listening, student attempts to answer with minimal prompting, and book-related comments or attempts at predicting future story events. They would try to tell you what's going to happen before you turn the page. Improvements in the changes continued to be observed for the full 10 weeks. Final scores for this particular group had a mean of 6.3 out of 9, up from that first mean of 0.87. And that's huge over 10 weeks. Now that's not improvements necessarily in proficiency, but that's changes in output from the students. They went from I can't and you can't make me to I can and you don't need to make me. I have a reason to use English. Right? Back to that first slide when we said I don't need English, I don't want to learn English, I can't speak English, why should I learn English? Now they have the reason to start using English. More importantly, in terms of participation, results from the study also showed that significantly more productive language use, a greater number of word types by post-intervention, okay, and a greater quantity. Many of them were taking more turns, interacting more often with the teachers. Okay, they're talking about the story. No longer it's about me as the teacher, it's me as the storyteller. Okay, I'm making the story interesting. They're interacting with me as the storyteller, not just as somebody reading a book. I'm the storyteller and they're interacting with me. Okay, and interactions also became lengthier as measured in the number of words per turn and increasing from no attempted utterances to more than 10 utterances per session by week 10. You get a kid that doesn't like to speak English, I can't, you won't make me, and now he's making 10 attempts at speaking English in a 30-minute session. That's huge. The changes and increases in the numbers of word types reflected a wider variety of lexical items in their language production. So they were attempting to use words they didn't have before, but they picked up from the stories that we were reading. They would attempt to use language that they had learned during the course of reading the stories, sharing the stories, and use those in the next or in a future story. So we're seeing increases in the lexicon, right? So is that necessarily an increase in proficiency? I don't know. A standardized test would say no. Okay, but there are those increases in lexical items that they're using. Their vocabulary is increasing. Okay, they went from no attempted utterances or just speaking gibberish to single words and short phrases. That's a big one for somebody that doesn't speak English. And while it does not necessarily imply the size of the vocabulary is increased from pre to post, it does indicate that they accessed a greater number of words that they did know, and they may have increased their vocabulary from use within the shared storytelling. While there's little research existing on storybook reading practices within the broader Asian context, Asia is not typically a book reader. Most of the cultures within Asia, not just Malaysia, not just Thailand, but most of the Asian cultures are not book cultures. They're not book based. Most families do. When I grew up at home, I had a library in my house. Okay, and I was normal. We had a couple of bookshelves and they were full of books. That's normal. In Asia, in the Asian context, that's not true. Most houses do not have several hundred books for children to read from. They don't have that opportunity for reading. And as Stephen Krashen said at COTISL in 2011, students who read extensively never speak badly. They can't. They don't know how. Students who read extensively can't write badly. Even if they try to, they've forgotten how to write badly. Right? So that reading culture is what we're trying to infuse into the kids. Get them reading. It doesn't have to be reading for content. Right? As teachers, we often focus on the reading for content. This is the story. What does it mean? Who cares? Read for fun. Read because you enjoy the reading. Tell stories. Share stories with your children. Right? You get the Singapore big book thing. Right? You get the big book out, you put it up, you start reading the story, you talk about the story, you talk about the pictures, and you interact with the children. And you become that storyteller. And as human beings, we've been doing that for 10,000 years, telling stories, oral histories. We've gotten away from it. Get back to it. Use books. Get children interested in reading. Literacy is the key fundamental. It doesn't matter what they read as long as they're reading. When they start reading, they improve in both their native tongue, they improve in English, they build their research skills. Even as young as kindergarten, they start becoming curious about everything out there because they read about it in a book. So we want to focus on those books. And the results that we see, while the results are different from student to student, no student showed a negative result. None. Okay? The increase in productive language is an intermediary step targeting specific reading skills. The more we read, the better they get. The better they get, the more they read. We begin that upward spiral that we keep trying to focus on. This work is not yet over. In this particular sample, this particular study, the sample is too small to extrapolate to a larger population. However, this was one tiny part of a tiny study that's part of a really big study that's running about 15 years. Okay? The reading thing, the shared reading and extended reading, has a longitudinal history that goes back to the early 1980s with the Fiji book flood with Warwick, and it's continued to the present day. Right? So there's a huge background. Within Europe, the studies have gone for almost 100 years within Europe and North American context. So there's a large body of information outside of the Asian context. And this is easily adaptable within the Asian context. Okay, so we look at adapting it, and it's really easy for teachers who don't have really strong linguistic skills. If you're not a really strong English-speaking teacher of English, you can use the books. The language is there for you to use, and you can interact with your students. Begin that process of interaction, begin that process of reading and literacy. Okay, ongoing work in this area is still being done with disaffected ESL learners at both the pre-literate stage as well as the early literate stage. And that's all I have for now. Yep, I'm done with 5 minutes left. She's waving the sign at me, so it's time for questions. Anybody, questions? Yep. Go ahead.
Okay, alright. So there's great motivation when it comes to increase student participation as well as quality and quantity in terms of the language output.
I didn't hear the first sentence.
There's great motivation when it comes to significant increase in the students' participation as well, the quality and the quantity in the language output. But I think what I missed probably the first part of your presentation maybe, which part of the shared reading activity do you think would greatly contributed in terms of this increased motivation to participate in the class?
Interaction between the student and the teacher. Getting away from just teacher asking a question and student answering a question, because that's coercive. The student's required to, when the teacher asks, students required to answer the question. When we begin engagement, it's non-coercive. The students talk to you because they want to say something, they want to communicate. Whether it's seeking information or telling you what's going to happen on the next page, telling you what they think, or just being really excited about what's happening in the story. They begin that interaction with the teacher rather than teacher asking questions and student answering. And if you think about your own classroom, every student I've ever met can answer a question. Teacher can ask, and student will always come up with a nice textbook answer. No problem. Try and get a student to ask a question. Just try. It's really, really, really difficult. Students are not used to asking the question. Right? And a student in Asia will not challenge a teacher. Ever. Typically, they won't tell the teacher, "Teacher, you're wrong." Unless it's like, maybe in kindergarten. But usually they won't say, "Teacher, you're wrong." Right? This is what I think it should be. what students need to be able to do that. If we want to develop critical thinking skills, if we want to develop those 21st century skills we keep talking about, students need to be able to communicate. They need to be able to question, infer, and comment on future events, comment on content. Okay, teachers don't need to be the giver of content anymore. Right? Back when I was a young child, the teacher was the giver of knowledge. My teacher knew everything and I knew nothing. Right? Nowadays, kids have these things. Google knows more than I do. Google is much faster than I am. I'm not the giver of knowledge. But I help them to decipher what's good knowledge to have, how to find it, how to use it, and that's another topic for discussion at another day. Okay, any other questions? Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes?
Mr. Batwell?
Yeah.
All right. Can you elaborate the steps that you use in the share reading?
Yep, it's about 20 slides long. And unfortunately,